First, I'd love to welcome the new faces with us today, and welcome back everyone who had to resist the urge to call us together during the last 2 weeks. I'm sure we all enjoyed a little bit of a break, but then at the same time as you kind of miss our time together. So today we are finishing Genesis, keeping up with the Jewish schedule for reading through the 5 books of Moses. Here we are looking at chapter, I guess, yeah, are we doing 6 chapters? Is that a mistake? 44 to 50. I think it's 47 to 50. 47, 28, just so you know. Okay, before we get actually into the meat, just how we do discussions here on eNoam and kind of the spirit behind it. So by way of introduction, we do have a mix here of Christians and Jews, and we've created this Torah discussion with the understanding that Christians and Jews have different, theological, what we call elephants in the room. So big differences in how we see certain theological ideas that in the Bible, in the scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures. And so we don't try to erase those differences. We actually learn to collaborate and talk about the books of Moses, staying on topic. So that's one of the ways that we can have really productive, good discussions as we focus on the chapters we're reading. And it's not that, as a Christian, you couldn't, bring in an idea that's from the New Testament, but we do ask that if let's say an Orthodox Jew or a Christian are bringing in an idea that's from another text, we ask that it would be brief because we want to stay on topic on the Torah. And also you preface it that it is from your tradition, it's from your background. That way we avoid making other people uncomfortable by saying things that imply they agree with us, because that's not always the case. And it's really good to be sensitive to that, whether you're a Christian or a Jew, understanding that what you're saying might not be universally agreed upon in the room. So we ask that you stick to the Torah portion. We try to stick on point and clarify if our viewpoint might be coming from something that's outside of everyone's common text discussion. So first thing I want to do is do a quick Parsha overview. And I was right. We are not starting at chapter 44. We're starting at chapter 47. And really, we start this reading with Jacob talking to Joseph about how he wants to be buried in Canaan. He wants to be buried with his family in the field of Machpelah. And it also specifies that Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, which to me was kind of like an interesting first thought, that Jacob actually had time to develop, routines. It wasn't like he just showed up in Egypt and then passed away. He had 17 years in Egypt. And which kind of comes in because Pharaoh really gives him a royal funeral in this. I'm calling it a royal funeral. I don't know if that's like technically accurate, but there's something really important there about how, Jacob came from Canaan into Egypt, spent 17 years there with his family, passed away, but really strongly insisted that he had to be brought back to be buried with his family in the Cave of Machpelah. So we have in chapters 48, the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, which interestingly enough actually creates this kind of declaration that Jacob makes that this will be a blessing for all Israel in the future, that they will be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And there's tradition today that really continues that I've heard many times where I hear, when people are blessing, when fathers are blessing children, you hear that blessing echoed up over and over again, which is kind of cool. Then 49, we see that Jacob blesses his 12 sons. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I actually didn't focus on the blessings today. We've talked about those things in the past, some of that stuff. I think it is important to highlight that the first 2 or 3, sons he's dealing with, he actually gives them a rebuke. So the first son, he gives him a rebuke for some form of what I can maybe label as sexual impropriety. And then the 2 other sons, Simeon and Levi, he rebukes the violence that they exercise. So I don't know, that kind of was interesting to me, that there is like an instruction involved in these are things you don't want to do. And then these are all the other blessings that you do want to have in your life. Going through Judah, great blessings, Issachar, wonderful things. All right, so finishing off chapter 49, Jacob again tells his sons, I must be buried. You have to swear to me you will bury me You won't, like, immediately. And that's clear. Like, it's not like, oh, bury me in Egypt and then take me to Canaan later. No. He wants to be buried right away in Canaan. So chapter 50, we then look at Jacob's Egyptian royal honor, where not only Yosef and the brothers, but then all the elders of Egypt go up to Canaan, which I think is really cool. There's something in that for me that sounds like a future. It sounds like a declaration of the future. It sounds like a partnership between nations and families that I think actually God put in the Torah because it's actually a future declaration. We're being reminded that there is a future partnership that looks like this, where families mourn together, families celebrate together, families bury their dead together. And so much so that the Canaanites actually thought it was an Egyptian procession when they came up. But it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't. It was for Jacob, Israel. So interesting thought. Another part of chapter 50. There's kind of a couple different things split into that particular chapter. The brothers bring up the fear. And so I'm just going to go back into this in a second, that they're afraid that Yosef, once their father passes away, is going to bring about revenge on them for what they did to him. So interesting that comes up again and causes Joseph to cry again. So he cries when he reveals himself to his brothers, and he cries when his brothers assume that he still has revenge in his heart towards them. Interesting point. And then we finish with the death of Yosef, and he makes a declaration that the God of Israel will bring them back from Egypt into the land of promise, as he promised to their three fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he says that he wants to be brought up as well. However, in contrast with Jacob and Israel, he basically instructs them to bury him in Egypt and then take his bones up later when they leave. So he wanted to leave when the people left. Not quite the same as Jacob, who wanted to be buried in Israel right away. All right, so paying attention to the details. Now, I just want to highlight, I have three sides here, and I just want to bring up three topics for discussion. And I just drew some scriptures here. You guys can use these slides if they're helpful in your discussion groups in a couple minutes. I'm going to quickly just outline the questions that seemed interesting to me, and we'll go from there. So first of all, and I've already kind of introduced this, that Israel insists on being buried in the field of Machpelah, or the Cave of Machpelah, which is there. And it's also like he's immediate. Why does Yaakov insist that they must take him up right now? Or not right now, once he passed away. And then why is there a difference with Yosef? Why does Yosef say, bury me here with you in Egypt, but take my bones up with you when you leave Egypt? It's like, I don't know, it's interesting that Yosef maybe had a sense that he could participate in the redemption. Whereas Yaakov knew that he needed to be in the land before the redemption somehow. I'm just throwing out ideas. So I included the two relevant scriptures here. Interesting thought, something to explore. What's going on there? All right. So the second kind of emphasis I wanted to bring out was this question of the brothers fearing Yosef's revenge, and how it seemed to touch Joseph's emotions quite deeply. And then I also started to think about what an interesting parallel with Yaakov and Esau, where when Esau was angry, he said out loud, I will wait until my father passes away, and then I will have my revenge on Jacob. And then Jacob says, his mother tells him to run, and he flees, right? So now we have this interesting parallel where the brothers, betrayed Joseph. Joseph ends out in exile, like kind of parallel with Jacob in a way, right? So Joseph ends up in exile, but that exile saves the brothers. And then he's operating in a heart of forgiveness. We see that when he's touched at how in the previous parsha, how Judah in particular pours himself out and offers him as an atonement maybe, to say that take me and send Benjamin back to my father. Somehow that breaks something. But it's interesting that even with that, the brothers still have this sense that there is a repetition maybe of a threat, of a pattern, because it would be a story, it'd be in the family story, right? And there's interesting because the parallel too with Jacob and Esau, when they do finally come back together after all the fear and all the anxiety, and then it seems like when they do come together, there's like this peace among them. There's this like, it's not a perfect peace by any means, and we know that in the future there's problems, but there isn't this cataclysmic clash of violence between Jacob and Esau. And so we see here with these other brothers, when Joseph doesn't have anything in his heart to cause them harm. And so I don't know, it just seems like, again, repetition of the same pattern. So I'm just bringing that up for discussion, something to chew on. And all right, so let's go to the next slide here. So my third and final thought here to bring up with you today is that all the Egyptian elders participate in Israel's burial, which is not, when you go back and read it, see, I put the passage here, Genesis 50, and Pharaoh answered, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went all the servants of Pharaoh. All right, so here we got a lot of alls here, right? All the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. I mean, it must have been a huge procession, I'm assuming. And also very heavy in terms of like the leadership of Egypt, as well as the core, leadership of Israel. And only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen, and then went up. And then it says, in verse 11, when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore, the place was named Aved Mitzrayim. It is beyond the Jordan. So I thought that was really cool, because it also brings echoes of certain prophetic scriptures that say that, Egypt is the Lord's people. And that there will be a highway, if we're looking at Isaiah 19, highway from Assyria all the way to Egypt, and the Hebrew will be a language that will be spoken across the entire region. These are future, in my understanding, I mean, some of you might disagree with me, but that these are future declarations that still have yet to occur. And so here I'm seeing these echoes already here. So it's really interesting that Egypt becomes the enemy of Israel really soon, in the next 400 years. If we're following the Parsha readings into next week, but that here we can see a brotherhood, we can see an allegiance, we can see a connection, we can see a faithfulness that is worth meditating upon. So with that, I'll take us to, these are just summaries of those 3 slides and the questions that I have. So I'll just remind you again, the first thing is, why is Jacob, Israel, so insistent on going directly to Canaan after his death? And why does Joseph have a different feeling where he seems to want to be buried in Egypt and to come back up to the land of Canaan with the people when they are redeemed out of their bondage of slavery? Second of all, why were the brothers still worrying about Yosef's vengeance? And why was that such a deep emotional connection? And what can we learn from maybe, again, repeating patterns in fathers repeating in the sons? Maybe we can learn something for our own lives about repeating patterns where there might be pain, echoes of evil things that have happened in the past that we relive. Anyway, just a thought. And then this connection between Egypt, declaring, I added a little flourish here, displaying some prophetic wisdom by participating fully in Israel's funeral procession. And that maybe these 2 families will be able to rejoice together and mourn together once again in the future. So with that, Kim, I think we can break out into our groups.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
We'll see you all back here at 2 o'clock-ish.
All right, bye-bye.
We hope that you all had a great chat in your room. And I hope that someone is ready to give a summary. We don't have a lot of time. We really try to stick to our 1 hour and 20-minute window here. So I'm going to try to pick someone from who would be able to share, Yair, from your room, who would be able to give us a quick summary of what you guys went over. Dave, would you want to? You're muted though, I think, so you need to unmute.
Mistake. I can't make a mistake if I'm not heard.
That's right.
It's like we were on just sort of the macro vision of Israel relating to the nations and human relations and the extension of family, the concept of family being brought in, that it's actually a very, very Hebrew notion. That the way God formed Joseph so he could be totally accepting of his brothers. He didn't have a religious veil on it. And in Christendom, we often go, oh yeah, I forgave him a long time ago, which usually means I haven't even tried to process it. But Joseph was really transformed by his hardships into becoming a real servant leader of his family and of the entire nation. Sometimes it takes stress and difficulty and hardship to reshape us, not just Joseph, but then the whole nation of Israel. They went out, they became aristocrats, and then they were squozed down to next to nothing because they had to go back to the land. And if they had just stayed comfortable in Egypt, they'd have just been a real wealthy family in Egypt. But that they had to go into suffering to be made hungry for the land of their father Jacob and Abraham and Isaac. So that was big. Those are the two that I'm remembering, because again, this was everyone's insights were so massive that we needed 2 hours to do what we did.
That's great. No, thank you, Dave. We're a little bit short on time because we had such great times in the rooms here, but that seems like a good summary. Maybe I'll jump in here and try to do justice to the chat that we had in our room. I have to say that Alan dumped a little bit of cold water on my idea of this nice royal funeral for Jacob, with the idea that it was actually a little bit of a double-edged, that there was a presence of Egyptian show of power and of force in order to maintain kind of control over the situation, and that already we're seeing sort of symbols of Egyptian kind of dominance. I think that's a fair characterization of what you shared, Alan.
That's a good summarization.
Yeah. So, which is interesting. That's why I love to be able to ask questions, because then I get answers that, are outside of, my
But it
knowledge.
was still everything you said it was at the same time.
Right. At the same time.
So
but
you're right. It was a double-edged sword. So I think that's a perfect metaphor.
Yeah. The other thing that came up, and Kim brought this up, was this difference between Joseph and Jacob in terms of the burial. Was that, Jacob is a patriarch. He is an inheritor of the promise. And so his, need to be buried in the land as a patriarch with Abraham and Isaac was because of that role. And none of the other sons, Joseph included, Joseph wasn't an inheritor of, the specific line of the promise to inherit the land. He was one of 12. And that, so very different roles within the family. And so that kind of is seen in, this view of the importance and the significance of the burial. The other side that Joe brought up just at the end of our discussion was, the symbolism, the messianic quality of Joseph's role, and brought up this idea that the idea of a Messiah being with the people in exile until they return to the land at the redemption. And so there's like a flavor of that messianic role there as well in Joseph that we see. The Christians really relate to, because we see this idea of, this messianic figure is very central to our view of the scriptures. So did I miss another important point in our discussion that one of you might remember just before we move on to the next room? I think those are kind of highlights for me. Kim did bring up one thing. This is just an extra credit question. was about the verse where it says that Israel needed to die, that there was this kind of strange statement that, it was time, the days, the days of Israel to die, basically, if I'm really loosely translating the Hebrew. It's just this really interesting verse that stood out for her, that she brought up, that we kind of didn't quite know exactly what to do with. One more thing. Sorry. Second extra credit was Ephraim, that Ephraim has a very specific promise. When he's blessed by Jacob, when you look at it, this special blessing for Ephraim is very interesting, because it talks about how his descendants will be many nations, or will be as many nations. And so we sort of touched on that, difference of translation and interpretation. All right. Yeah. Great stuff. Sorry, Kim, go ahead.
Didn't realize it's muted.
Yeah.
So it appears, when you look at that it was the Abrahamic covenant was passed through Ephraim. And that is where we didn't go any further. We just stopped there and said, we'll pick it up again later.
It's above my pay grade as far as Torah interpretation. So, all right. So in the next room, who would like to speak for the last room?
I'll start, and then we're tag
Okay.
teaming.
Thank you,
So,
Lisa.
one thing that Moshe brought out was that, we were talking about revenge and mindsets, and the brothers fearing Joseph, what was going to happen after his father died, and how he wept over it. And it was because they didn't bring God into the situation. But Joseph, his words are, who am I? Am I God? They weren't thinking in a godly way. They weren't thinking, as Father God being in the picture. And that was the game changer. That's the mindset. I loved when Yair was here in the United States, because I keep going back to this. They are Israel, and yet they are becoming Israel. They were a family, and Moshe said this today too. They were becoming Israel. So it was the process of this family coming into their identity. And so Joseph must introduce God, because that's part of the identity. And so they hadn't grabbed hold of that yet. And it's the beautiful process of transformation that we're seeing in the midst of the crucible of the suffering. So Ruth, you're next.
Very good. Wow.
Ruth, you're next.
I'm on. So the one other main point that the group chose was the idea of flexibility. And that related to the story of Jacob blessing Ephraim over Manasseh. And that idea is a recurring theme in this whole story of Genesis, where God chooses the younger daughter, the younger brother, and that leads to a lot of conflict within the families, and jealousy and competition for the father's love, the mother's love, the father to love the mother, and how the importance of there being flexibility in allowing God to choose, but also within the group of seeking authentic reconciliation and understanding between each other about the roles that they have that don't necessarily have to go like in Britain. It's King Charles that gets the throne.
Sort of a midrashic historical note. We were talking about the burial procession. It's not explicit in the Torah, but the Midrash and the Talmud explain that at the actual burial, there was an altercation, that Esav came and contested Jacob's burial at Machpelah. So there was a scuffle. And Dan's son, who was deaf, Hushim, actually killed Esav and chopped off his head. The head rolled into the Cave of Machpelah. So both Jacob and effectively Esav are buried together on the same day, which is interesting because Rivka had a pregnancy day. Her two children would die. Actually, it turns out they were buried on the same day. They didn't die on the same day. And there are ramifications to that altercation where Esau's grandson Tifo, who was captured by the Egyptians and later escapes, eventually through a variety, it's a long story, I won't take up time, makes his way to Rome and becomes a warlord, and later on attacks Egypt and the Jewish people, only to be defeated again, which sets up the whole dynamic of how did Esau become Rome. It's through the grandson of Esau, through this incident, that initiates that continues that antipathy, but becomes a very bloody one for the rest of history. So I just wanted to throw in that historical.
To end on a more positive note, I would like to say that when Jacob commands us to bless our sons that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, he commands this because there's no jealousy between Ephraim and Manasseh. Even though Jacob switched hands and actually gave preference to the younger son, which in the past has been a source of so much trouble, including with Esau that you just mentioned, and including with Joseph. But now finally this process of becoming an Israel, of becoming a nation with purpose, we're recognizing that every single person, every single nation has a place in God's plan, and that God loves all of us. That is why we bless our children, that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, because that's the way they were, and that's the way we also have to become. So while there were a lot of things that didn't go well in the beginning, that's part of the learning process, we are here now in order to fix it and do it right.
Amen.
Wow.
Hey,
Thank you, everybody. Have a blessed week.
Thank you for your wonderful questions. They were so good.
Great job.
Yeah,
Great
really
job.
great job.
Good job.
Sure, Tov.
Good job. Because but we don't know, Alan. We might know the timeline now. But what
We
did
didn't.
Abraham past Yitzchak, past Yaakov, and what Hashem says, which was, 400 years. So, we know, and we don't even, we know now that probably that 400 years actually started at the time of Abraham. So it wasn't even when you're actually in Egypt, it was the whole.
Right.
So, but, so they really, they really didn't have a lot of hope there.
Right. They know they were stuck for the duration.
Yeah, they sure did. Anyone else? We have Christine, but Christine, we don't hear your voice. And we have Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Special, just so we could get to meet you and enjoy your comments. And you're with us as well. So hi, Denise.
Hello.
So did
I
anyone?
don't see you.
So we have also what Gabriel brought out about Israel in 16. He goes back to Hebron, and even before that, right before that, the Torah opens up with one of the most interesting, I think, statements: Israel must die. I don't know if that statement has ever caught anybody's attention, but we see that that's not the only time we see this kind of, it's almost like that statement was more than just for the moment, but it was a prophetic statement on, the whole concept of death and birth, dying and birth, rebirth, being reborn through the process of death, dying to yourself, dying, so very interesting statements in the Torah.
Where is that? Do you know the reference to the verse?
Yes, I will find that reference for you right
Love to take a peek at it. But one of the funs, while you're looking that up, one of the fun things about being able to create slides is you get to ask the questions that you have. And so it's interesting to hear your guys' feedback right away about, first of all, like Yaakov he's a patriarch. So the symbolism or the significance of him being buried in the land as kind of like, part of that three patriarch heritage. Now I can make sense. And also, Leah's buried in the cave already. And so he wants to be, that's very interesting that you can really see that forking where the sons now they don't, I don't know how you describe that, the language, but they don't carry in a way the symbolic, none of them individually, right, carry this inheritance. They all collectively carry the inheritance together, which is like an interesting thing where all of a sudden, poof, right? There's now this like, and then Ephraim and Manasseh, that's another actually interesting dynamic, because that they're brought in as, like Jacob says, they're mine. Where it's like, well, like Jacob's taking, Joseph's sons as being kind of his own, so that, I don't know, it's an interesting, not being super well versed maybe in the kind of Jewish way of thinking about that.
Okay, can I weigh in on that a little bit?
Yeah, please do.
So the various commentaries talk about this uniqueness, because you don't see Yaakov saying this about any of the other sons' children.
No.
So Ephraim and Manasseh are singled out. Why? There are probably several reasons, but one of the reasons that stood out to me, Joseph had already been in Egypt, and Joseph had climbed the ladder, prophetically speaking, and his sons were with him, and they did not assimilate. They showed the strength of character and accepted Joseph's faith and ultimately Jacob's faith, and they were able to remain separate and God-fearing. That distinguishes them, because the other children previously were in Canaan with the rest of the family. So these are the only two grandchildren who withstood the assimilation pressures of living in a corrupt nation like Egypt. So that singles them out for honorable mention. So the honorific of Yaakov adopting them as de facto his children is that it's an honorific, it's an elevation of them to tribal status.
Yeah.
Right, so that they too in the future will be tribal leaders, even though they are really two components of the tribe of Joseph.
Except something very interesting. No, I'm sorry. I
Go
didn't
right
mean-
ahead. I'm done.
Except I wanted to say, it's not an exception. However, Alan, is something else happens, because you know who does get the covenant passed? It's Ephraim. No,
Oh, I see.
not Judah. It's Ephraim. And this is where it gets so interesting. So by the way, it's in 47:29, and the time drew near that Israel must die. Very interesting statement. That's 47:29. However, this thing with Ephraim is so interesting, because he gets the blessing of Abraham. It's not passed to Judah. And that's, everybody thinks it's passed to Judah. But when you read the blessing, and he's putting his hands, right, on the two boys, and Joseph says, "No, my father, you got it wrong." And he puts his hand on the younger, Ephraim. This is what he says. He says, and his father refused. "I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Howbeit his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations."
Mm-hmm.
This is, and he blessed them that day. The actual Abrahamic covenant now is passed through Ephraim. And now this becomes incredibly interesting when you look at the prophets, because Ephraim is center stage in all of the prophets. Hashem wanting Ephraim back home. And this, because he's been divorced from God because of the acts of idolatry. So that was the thing I wanted to bring up, Gabriel, because that became, we all, when they focus on the blessings, they always focus on the blessings of the sons. But the blessing that passes to Ephraim from Jacob is not just because of an elevated status, but Ephraim gets the blessing. Okay. Would we like to chime in?
So just one comment. I guess there's probably translator's privilege when you're translating to English, because the Sephariah English translation says, and his offspring shall be plentiful enough for nations.
Yes.
So there,
I also have Rashi's. I was in Rashi yesterday on this as well. So Rashi also has, it's like a fullness.
So I guess that means that there's probably room for interpretation depending on the scholar as to how strongly, maybe, is that the right way of saying it? How strongly to read into this. Zaro yehiyeh melo hagayim is essentially what it says there.
Exactly. However, when you get into Yermahu, Shloshim Vechad, the whole covenant is passed to Ephraim. And that's very interesting. And you see that there's a whole big thing here that starts here.
Yeah.
So, but you are correct. There is definitely open for discussion, but there's very little discussion on it, which is also interesting. That's
Well, I think it's fair to say it's kind of perceived, at least to me anyway, as a pretty mysterious kind of thing. Like, unless people who don't really go into the Midrash. I know a lot do in the Orthodox community, but certainly in the Christian community, kind of read it and go, that's kind of interesting. What's going on there? Yeah. I'm not sure where to take that though.
nowhere. It's just
It's interesting. Yeah. No,
I'll say, wow, those are some great thoughts and some great insights. And it's just, I have a commentary in my complete Jewish Bible that mentions something about this dialogue when Yaakov is blessing these grandsons. And they did mention, well, this had to do with when they're going to divide the land in the future. And, they said a few things like that. So it wasn't really giving a whole lot of insight any further than that. But one of the things Gabe said earlier, I wanted to just touch on, and maybe because I'm an emotional type of person and I really sense things in my spirit, of people's emotion with regard to what's going on. And in the opening comments, Gabriel had mentioned about Joseph crying. He cried when he revealed himself, and then he cried again when the brothers had developed that trust with regard to his intentions. But, and I just have to say, because, you had mentioned about this emotion, and first of all, think of Joseph. He did not, as far as I know, Joseph did not, through the whole 17 years of his exile, of his, after being sold into slavery by his family, like, it doesn't give an indication that he's like, oh yeah, this is the plan of God, and this is how, things are going to pan out. Like, he didn't know that. The biblical characters that we read about, we know because we see the whole story, but they didn't know. And so when I think of him crying, like, when he first revealed himself to his brothers, when he realized, they really changed, and now they're protecting Benjamin, and the little test he put them through, and And so when he revealed himself like that, he sent all the Egyptians out of the room. But nevertheless, he cried so hard and wept so. I mean, I just think of the emotion that they heard him in the household. They heard him, think of that 17 years. And now realizing this promise, he sees them bowing down and he remembers the dream, and he's able to say, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Like, this is the indication we know he now recognizes this is the fulfillment of that promise and that dream to him. And I don't know, and then when he goes into Jacob with his kids and he's just like, I can't even imagine, the joy, first of all, in that first revealing and realizing my father's still alive. I can see him. I might be able to see him, and just like, how long does it take to recover from taking all that in? And so I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about when I read that story, I just think of the glory of God. Like, his plans are perfect. They're all thought out from the beginning to the end. And trusting him, even when we don't understand what's happening around us, even when we have questions like Joseph had or Jacob had, when you trust him, one day you will know and you will see that glory of God and you'll understand the purpose for it all for those who trust in God. And so those are my thoughts.
No, thank you, Denise. One thing you just made me think about as well in the midst of this, that there's also room for, like for Joseph, for example, just as a human, right? That he would probably have to process trauma in the midst of,
Right.
Like, so it, the glory, or, talking about the perfection of like how God brought this together for salvation for the whole family. But what's interesting is that for Joseph as an individual, he would still have to, but like my heart still hurts,
Yeah.
I still have grief and pain from being betrayed, sold into slavery, abused, and used in a household as a slave, lied about, thrown into prison, and that it's just funny. It's just interesting to mix in this idea that like, the amazing, glorious, how do you say, like miraculous workings of God also coexist with real human suffering.
His choice. He chose. He had the power to just say away with them.
Yeah.
He could have done it, but he chose a different path.
Yeah.
He chose that with the character this man had. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Denise and Gabriel, that makes me think of a discussion we had at Shabbat evening. I got to go over to to Yair and Dina's house for a small group Torah discussion, and that's one of the things we were talking about was free will, like how Hashem can allow both good and evil to happen in our lives. He's control of the entire universe, and our free will comes into play because we have the ability to choose how we're going to respond to what happens in our lives, and Denise as well, like the emotion and the real like gritty realness of what these people go through. Like, why does Hashem in the Torah have this whole side story of Yehuda with his sons? And it's like, but it's there for a very important reason, because we get to see of all the other sons, Yehuda is the one that first of all feels the pain of losing a child that his father felt, that Yaakov, that Israel felt, of losing Yosef, and not just one but two. He's like, and it also says that it's like the second son doesn't have a child with Tamar in order to carry on his older brother's legacy, and he's just like had no regard for his brother, and because of that, Hashem allowed him to die. And later on, when Yosef is like accusing the brothers, they're like, "See, like we disregarded our brother's cries, and this is why this is Yosef's cries, and this is why this is happening to us." And it was Yehuda of all the other brothers that when Yosef said had played the whole thing out and was like, "No, I'll just take Benjamin as a slave. You all can go back." It was Yehuda was the one that stood up and said, "No, you can't do this." And he was the only one that could really, out of the pain that he experienced, and out of that pain, it ended up bringing healing for the whole family because he stood up when nobody else did against Yosef. And in the commentaries, the Jewish commentaries say that he was even willing, when it says that he approached Yosef, that Yehuda was ready to fight for Binyamin at that stage. He cared about his father and his brother and his family so much. And also like that whole story of Yehuda with Tamar, he also had this whole experience of humility, of seeing that like Tamar saw that her father-in-law was not doing the right thing, and she wanted to have children. And so the whole story plays out, and Yehuda says, "She is in the right and I was wrong." And that's the quality of leadership that Hashem is looking for, someone who uses that free will that they have, that God gives to each and every one of us, to respond in an attitude of humility and of empathy with other people, and that's the kind of leadership that we're looking forward to with Mashiach, with like the son of David. So yeah, it's like what you both brought up. I just think I love this whole part of the story. I just think it's so powerful. You have these stories before with Ishmael and Yitzchak, and then Yaakov and Esav. You have these stories of like the brothers just going in completely opposite directions. And now, for the first time, you have all the brothers. They've all gone through this these very hard, tragic things. And instead of holding on to pain, holding on to bitterness or anything, they're all able to forgive each other and come together and really see how Hashem, even through hardship, was able to work good in all those situations. So this is like one of my favorite parts of the Torah.
Aren't you glad that we don't have all these perfect people in the Bible, in the Torah, so that we, can never measure up, or we can never really relate to? Because, like you're saying, just normal human emotion or normal human behaviors and choices that we make, but yet these examples that are in there, it's just so for our benefit, for our training and our teaching, to see the end results.
Look, one dimension too, that I just want to get through this out, and I'd love to ask Joe if you'd like to share anything. We really value participation. The brothers actually, when they betrayed Joseph, that was the beginning, in the sense that the difficult feelings of dealing with a brother who is above them, in the sense of like immeasurable status, right? So in the beginning, it was the love of the father, right? So that, Jacob loves Joseph and he shows him, great things. Joseph has dreams. Joseph shares, maybe in a self-aggrandizing way, his delusions of grandeur. They get upset. But then the thing is, the truth is, the reality was going to be even worse for them, in the sense of like this, like they were going to be serving, like he was going to be Pharaoh's court. He was going to be, he had armed guards at his disposal. He had wealth, and you know what I mean? So it was like almost like, in a way, like they had to be weaned on the smaller, discomfort, so that they'd be able to deal with the future discomfort and be able to function with it, right? Because they were going to have to face a Joseph who was, in turn, pardon the pun here, but at the top of the pyramid, and so that was what they were going to have to deal with in the future. So it's just interesting. It really came to pass almost at every level, that Joseph was lifted, and then Jacob blessing his sons above their own, in a sense, is even another level of like continuation of like, look, our brother's being raised above us. We hate this. It's a natural human emotion is all I'm saying. And
There's another aspect to this too. I mean, the brothers came to the realization that this was the hand of God that orchestrated all these events. So, accepting that they did an avera, they sinned, they feared that they'd be punished. And it could likely be, and it was even logical, that it would be Joseph who would be the one to deliver the punishment. As it turns out, it wasn't. But it would have been a very natural assumption once they had accepted this idea that they had sinned. And who did they sin against? Joseph, right? And now Joseph is in a position to respond in kind. And their own religious expectation is they should have been punished for their sin, right? So that's why there was this part of the reason why there was this continuing fear that Joseph still might retaliate, because theologically it would actually balance the scales.
Yes. True, like in a sense that they were expecting true justice. They were waiting for true justice. Wow.
They're waiting for the shoe to fall.
Yeah.
And it doesn't fall, and that could be excruciating in and of
Never
itself.
thought of it that way.
Kind of like at the end of King David's life, where he was about to die, and he tells his successor that it's like, there are these issues of justice that you need to take care of for me, which is not very pleasant, like reading about those things. And but like as a king, he knew that it's like for justice to be like held to in the kingdom, these certain things need to be taken care of. So yeah, Alan, that was a really good point you brought up, like how amazing that is what happened with his brothers.
I think it did. It just didn't happen like they might have thought, but what Joseph done to get their attention by deceiving them and tricking them on both the trips, right? And keeping Shimon and then
Raise their anxiety levels.
Mm-hmm.
Putting the money back in the pack and the goblets, right? The Kiddush cup. I don't know, but that is justice. He was actually, I think, adjudicating. And
You could look at it that way too, but
yeah.
again, they're still thinking of punishment from heaven, right?
Right.
So for them, now that they had weathered the anxiety of all those events you just outlined, there could have been another shoe to fall, and they were concerned about that. And that's a very normal human thing.
Yeah. I mean,
very interesting. You could probably, yeah, go Joe. Let's see.
Oh, it's my turn? Yeah. Well, yeah,
no
thanks. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, for myself, I just find it helpful I'm a big picture thinker, and we're at the end of the book of Genesis. And what I see in this is that the ultimate destiny for the people of Israel, their final redemption, is in the promised land. And I think this is symbolized with Jacob insisting to be buried in the promised land. But I also see in the bigger picture, if you start with the Abraham story and work our way through to Joseph, and before I go any further, I just want to check in with Gabriel. Like, I do believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, but I draw heavily from Jewish tradition as well as from the Christian scriptures, and so I don't know if that's acceptable in these discussions or not, but that's kind of the way I try to approach looking at this story.
I think, so just to maybe help you understand the way we do things, just understand that we're in a room with 3 Orthodox Jews who don't believe that.
Yeah.
So we don't impose on them that belief, but you can share something that's relevant to this parsha, understanding the sensitivity of that.
Yeah, like from Jewish tradition, I believe that all the prophets speak of the coming of the days of Mashiach, and I think that's well established in Jewish tradition. And so, and I also believe that, these are, that the Torah provides a blueprint for Israel's final redemption. And in this in the book of Genesis, as we work towards the end where we're at now, I see, Abraham, who is called to, what the Torah says, sacrifice his only son. And in Jewish tradition, it's even believed that Isaac actually was killed and rose and was resurrected. And then I see Joseph in Jewish tradition is seen as a forerunner of the Mashiach. So this is all from Jewish tradition. Please correct me, with my Jewish Orthodox brothers who are in the room, if this is not part of the tradition, but this is my understanding is part of the tradition. So when I, put all that together, and when I see Israel or Jacob wanting to be buried in the land, and Joseph wanting to stay behind, but only be taken out once Israel leaves, I see that in the context of the final redemption of Israel. I see, in Jewish tradition, it is believed that when Israel goes into exile, and Egypt is seen as an exile by the Jewish sages, that the Mashiach would go with Israel into exile and stay with them in exile until they are actually brought out and into the land of Israel. So I see not only like a future destiny of the people of Israel, but I also see a foreshadowing of the Mashiach in the sense that he would be with Israel in exile until they're actually taken out into their final destiny in the land of Israel. And so in the whole Genesis story, I see a father who sacrifices his son that was resurrected. This is all part of Jewish tradition, and that Israel would end up in the land, but they would only end up in the land until they can't end up in the land without Mashiach actually coming or bringing them there. So that's kind of what I see in that big picture and how this, Genesis ends. So I'm just trying to draw on, both aspects, because I see, the whole Bible as a continuous story, not only the Tanakh, but going right through to the New Covenant scriptures. Yeah.
And obviously the
So that's, yeah. Yeah.
Whenever you get into messianic theories and covenants, it gets a little fuzzy between the two religions, but I don't believe in mainstream Jewish theology. The belief is that Isaac was in fact sacrificed and was resurrected. So that does not appear in Jewish tradition at all.
I've never heard
I understand that. I never heard that. I'm on book 831 of my Jewish.
It's like a Christian tradition because it's in the book of Romans, right?
It's certainly not the majority opinion. It's certainly not
mainstream, but it is.
Right.
There was yeah.
There's it may be a speculation, but it was never established as theological norm. Just to put it on that.
Right.
You made an interesting point about the Mashiach being in exile with the Jewish people. Moshe is actually the paradigm for the Messiah, not of being in exile and coming out with the Jewish people. When you get into Jewish messianic theology, there is the belief that there are two Messiahs. And again, the word Messiah simply means anointed. Kings were anointed, prophets were anointed. The word Mashiach appears in many instances for many different people and situations. But there's supposed to be Mashiach ben Yosef, and then Mashiach ben David, which is the king Messiah that everybody thinks of as the primary Messiah figure. The role of Messiah ben Yosef has to do with fighting the war of Gog and Magog against the nation, instead of then being resurrected by Mashiach ben David. So it's understandable how a different religion might misunderstand or misinterpret that in terms of first and second comings, in terms of the fact that there are two versus one. But again, the Isaac dying and being resurrected, I came across one reference of it, and it was immediately dismissed as either a linguistic misunderstanding or something along those lines, but it is clearly not normative Jewish theology.
It's also interesting, Alan, and we're going to have to go up to this, but what's also interesting, coming back to that original discussion we were having about Ephraim and Manasseh, and what's also interesting that Rashi says in Joshua. So Moshe comes out of Levi, right? But Joshua actually comes out of Ephraim. So this is that. So it gets so interesting. And actually Gideon comes from Manasseh. So there's so many, this thing with Ephraim gets so interesting. Now I've shared something, but I'm not going to share it now because we got to go. But next time, because I did share something on this whole Ephraim thing because it gets so interesting. I started to write a book called The Mystery of Ephraim because you know how every time I was turning around in the Torah, all I could see was Ephraim, and I thought, this is crazy because so often when Christians pick particular texts in the prophets, it's outside of the context, you know, and it's allotted to maybe Mashiach or this, and yet if you read in the context, it's all coming back to Ephraim, which is extremely interesting. So I think this has been a very interesting conversation, and thank you, Joe, for adding to that interesting conversation.